Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar event presented by Ingram Micro Cloud, devoted to helping you build a cybersecurity practice. This is our second webcast of our series devoted to helping our partners grow what the industry estimates to be an $129 billion industry by 2025, and that is security. So for today's webinar, we have some lovely guests presenting around our Microsoft 365 Business Premium aligned to CIS Framework webcast. We have our guest, David Preeb, Senior Technical Support at Ingram Micro, and David Bierman-Burr, Security Architect from Microsoft, who will be guiding you through this session on why adopting a framework is the right thing to do for your customer. My name is Brianna Lau, Growth Solutions Lead for Seamless Security here at Ingram Micro. And before we get started, I just want to leave some housekeeping notes here for our guests in attendance. Because this is a live webcast, we are streaming on Teams webinar. And if you would love to get access to this deck, the recording, we will have an email with all those links plus call to action links to anything that we discuss in terms of collateral sent to you within 24 hours of this event happening. And also, because we are live, please utilize our chat window. If you have any questions about the topics that are presented, we'll also leave some time at the end for Q&A so that you can come off mute if you want to ask something to our guests here. In today's agenda, we'll be talking about key areas of growth and why security. We'll also be reviewing cybersecurity frameworks and assess kind of the similarities and differences between the top ones in the industry. We'll also be diving deeper into why the CIS Control Framework is an easy way to get started for partners wanting to build a security-first MSP practice. How to get started in building a security-first MSP, what are the 4 steps that you need to do? And some closing and Q&A for our participants on this call. So to kick it off, I want to introduce you to where we believe will be the key areas of growth for our partners. Here at Ingram, we've become growth obsessed in helping our partners organize and define the focus areas where we believe can drive optimized business outcomes and accelerated growth. And our mission is entirely focused on becoming a very customer-centric approach of leading with solutions that customers are demanding for. And so in building that strategy, we've really narrowed it down to 4 pillars. Modern cloud platforms, which is all about app modernization and data and insights, seamless security, connected workplace, and business performance. Speaking specifically on the opportunity for cybersecurity, which we call seamless security, it's estimated by the 2022 Forrester Analytics Global Survey that an average of 30% of an organization's IT budget is going to be spent on security, with IT decision makers prioritizing and improving 1, application security, improving their threat intelligence capabilities, and improving their identity and access management tools as their top priority with that budget. And for that reason, we believe that the largest areas for growth of our partners is to develop a security specialty around the pillars of endpoint, identity, and security operations. So starting with endpoint security, which encompasses services and solutions around protecting entry points like end user devices, desktops, laptops, and mobile devices. This will be the fastest growing area for customer organizations. Taking from Gartner, by 2025, 50% of organizations will be using some type of managed detection and response service, pointing to the importance of not only owning AV or endpoint detection tools, but also leveraging machine learning or a dedicated team to monitor and respond to these threats. Looking at identity security, which encompasses the services and solutions around securely authenticating, centrally controlling, and auditing how applications use privileged credentials. This is going to be the largest opportunity for our partners to address, as organizations are going to be looking at identity management as a baseline for their security posture. And then finally, security operations, which focuses on SIEM solutions to provide consolidated operations to either detect, investigate, and respond within one dashboard and view. This will be a larger investment for partners that are really looking to specialize in building that in-house SOC or Security Operations Center with tools like Microsoft Sentinel as a starting place. So I want to move to the next slide, which is speaking specifically around the SMB opportunity. We see that the security partner revenue opportunity simultaneously grows at a similar rate in respect to the overall Microsoft Modern Work solution portfolio. In the 5 different areas partners can focus on and align their business strategies around, SCI, or Security, Compliance, and Identity, comes up as one of the faster growing workload focuses with 38%, I should say, year-over-year growth on average, and an average user revenue of $32.80 per month, with a 33% average attach rate for each opportunity present. There's value in leading as a security MSP. There is a need in the industry, especially when services like managed detection and response are becoming a need in the industry, and technical resources are becoming either harder to find or harder to hire. If you're already adopting a Microsoft Modern Work portfolio, there's a space to add measurable value to your customers. And in order for you to adopt this strategy, you need to adopt a security framework and as a minimum to ensure that you're providing measurability in your work. The reason why we're coming to you today is that we're helping our partners in making it an eased focus by pitching a solution like Microsoft 365 Business Premium that aligns to the industry frameworks like the CIS Control. It's extremely cost effective, providing the same, if not more, of what can be generally accomplished by piecemealing other third-party tools together. So with that, I want to move it over to our next presenter, David Pree, who's going to get started in talking about assessing the various tools and how to get started in understanding what's available today.
Thank you, Brianna. And allow me to extend my own personal greeting to you this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're located. What I want to do today is as the slide here states, I want to really dig into the CIS Control Framework and really, I guess, pitch it to you as the framework that is going to be the prime framework you want to adopt in your security practice. And the reason I start here is because what we're going to find, and what I'm going to try to do, is I'm going to try to alleviate a lot of the vagueness, is the word I'll use, associated with quote unquote frameworks. If anyone's gone out onto the internet and done any kind of searching on, okay, what's a framework? What's a security framework? You're going to get all kinds of stuff. And there doesn't seem to be a truly consistent path that you can follow to really move your way through this topic. So yeah, the main point I'm trying to drive here is, yep, we want to focus on CIS, and we'll get into exactly why as we proceed through the presentation, but I also want to try and address a lot of the complexities, a lot of the vagaries that are out there as it pertains to frameworks. So with that context set, let's kick into, all right, first off, let's just ask the basic question. What is a cybersecurity framework? Now, we should just look at that question first, even before we look at the definition, because when we look at the question, it's very interesting the words that are used here. Specifically, framework. What's a framework? Well, fundamentally, a framework is what you might think of as a foundation. So if you were to draw an analogy between what we're talking about here and a house, well, what's the framework for a house? It's basically the foundation. That's all that it is. It's basically the base point on which other aspects of the house is built on. Or in the context of cybersecurity, A framework is the foundation on which the detailed security policies and activities are based on. So that's the first thing to understand about what a cybersecurity framework is really all about. This is the foundation, and it's from there that we basically have the ability to build and tailor solutions based on the needs of the end customer. So going back to the question, what is a cybersecurity framework? The second thing I want to point out here is, hey, like I said, there's no governing body for cybersecurity frameworks. And what this really refers to is the fact that because there are no governing body, there's no one single governing body, there's no one single definition. And the point here is that this definition that I'm showing on the screen is basically one that I landed on that I think really touches on all the key points and all the key aspects that are relevant to a cybersecurity framework. So what is that definition? It is this: cybersecurity frameworks are sets of documents describing guidelines, standards, and best practices for designed for cybersecurity risk management. The frameworks exist to reduce an organization's exposure to weaknesses and vulnerabilities that hackers and other cyber criminals may exploit. So that's really what we're talking about from a cybersecurity framework, and what really a good definition is for a cybersecurity framework. Now, as we dig deeper into cybersecurity frameworks, what we're also going to see is this. There are really three different categories of cybersecurity frameworks. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to start at the top on the right-hand side and on the bottom of the list on the left-hand side with the risk frameworks. Okay, what is a risk framework? Well, a risk framework is where basically an organization assesses their internal IT infrastructure and assesses it based on risk. And then basically, as a result of that assessment, they will then assign the appropriate resources in the form of dollars as well as activities in order to shore up that risk, or basically provide defenses for that resource that they want to in turn protect. Now, as you can see here, we have some $3 symbols in the graphic, and that definitely is there to represent the fact that, yes, these types of frameworks are fairly expensive. Okay, well, why? Well, one of the big reasons why is because when you deal with risk-based frameworks, you have to have someone who is knowledgeable in literally building that type of assessment, a risk-based assessment. Then you have to have people that are knowledgeable in building policies and security practices around those risk-based assessments. So yes, there's a whole lot of resources in the form of expertise and individuals that are able to leverage that expertise in order for an organization to assess their organization from a risk-based perspective, and then finally come to actionable activities in order to protect those assets based on the risk assessment that they have performed. So that's number one, risk. Number two, program. Well, what's a program framework? Well, it's kind of similar to risk, but instead of assessing an organization based on risk, what we're really doing is we're assessing an organization infrastructure and data based on security itself, basically security best practices. So, what is the current state of an organization security program? And then what we do is, after we do that assessment, we basically, if necessary, build the security program and policies and procedures and activities in order to address the needs of that organization as it pertains to their security needs. And again, we see the $ symbols there. And yeah, I mean, it's not quite as expensive as a risk-based framework, But it's still expensive because number one, what are we doing? We're assessing the current state of an organization. We're then taking that information and we are translating it into actions and policies that need to be implemented. So once again, we have a pretty expensive venture here where we have to have the knowledgeable people who have, again, the expertise to do all of this in order to get to our end goal of what policies, what activities, what procedures should I implement to secure my organization. Then finally, control frameworks. What's the deal with control frameworks? Well, control frameworks are basically where you have an organization, a knowledgeable organization like CIS, Center for Internet Security. And basically what they do is they fundamentally provide a predefined, prescribed set of activities that in turn can be adopted by organizations and are in order to shore up their security infrastructure. Now, as you can imagine, based on that, there's a very minimal cost associated with this. Why? Because the activities and the procedures are predefined. They're pre-prescribed by the standards organization or the framework organization. And in this case, the CIS top 18, which is what really we're focusing on here from this presentation perspective. So, yeah, again, this is what's the point of this? The point is that there's a whole lot of cybersecurity frameworks that are out there. And really what we're trying to drive at is why should we go after this particular one, namely the CIS top 18 controls rather than other ones. And to really try and drive that point home, let's do a deeper dive on what's one of the more popular other types of frameworks, a programmatic framework, specifically the NIST CSF, or Cybersecurity Framework from NIST. What we do here with the NIST CSF is we basically have a framework that is built based on three, I want to use the word core, but I can't because it's already taken up in the framework, but three fundamental principles. And those fundamental principles are here: the core, the tiers, and the profile. And what the point of the NIST CSF is this. We start with core. Okay, what is core? Core is actually a list of activities. This is basically, the stuff that you should do in order to, the recommendations that you should do in order to secure your infrastructure. I apologize, but someone is echoing out there pretty badly. So if we could go on mute. Okay. All right. So core is number one, actions. That's basically the actions that that NIST recommends to perform in order to secure an environment. But then we have this tiers thing. What is tiers? Well, tiers is basically what you might think of as the level of cybersecurity implementation that the organization is currently at. So in NIST CSF, there are really four tiers. There is the partial tier, and that's the lowest end. And that's where you have customers that are basically doing cybersecurity assessments ad hoc. There's really no fundamental policy, no overarching policy set. So they're basically doing this on an ad hoc basis, i.e. on an as-need-be basis. Okay, so that's the lowest level. Then we have tier 2, which is the risk-informed, where, yeah, we have some policies, but there's nothing that is basically organization-wide. So think of different departments that are doing their own thing. Then we have tier 3, which is improvement over tier 2, where we now, yes, we have essentially organization-wide policies, procedures, and practices in order to protect our environment. And then we finally end at tier 4, which is adaptive. And that's where basically we are very fluent in cybersecurity. In fact, we are taking input from the industry and assessing the existing security risks that are currently out there. And we are adjusting our budgets in order to protect those high security assets against those present day stuff. So yeah. Oops, kind of jumping ahead here. So that is basically our tiers. Now, profile, what's that? Well, profile is basically where an organization takes their core, their activities, as well as what tier they're at, what level of implementation are they at, and they say, this is where we are today, and if we want to move to somewhere else tomorrow, how do we get there? Okay, well, what's the point of this exercise? Because again, I've just spent a whole lot of time on NIST CSF when we're not really even driving NIST CSF. The reason for this exercise is to demonstrate the complexity and the intensive resources that are needed by an organization in order to implement this type of framework. And again, this is a programmatic framework. Risk frameworks are even worse. So from an SMB perspective, from a partner perspective, what kind of resources would you have to dedicate in order to enable this type of framework as the basis for your security practice? And this is where we finally get into, again, the main focal point of what we're trying to drive to here, which is we should really be looking at a cybersecurity control-based framework. And what is a cybersecurity control framework? It is a predefined and pre-prioritized set of recommended activities or tasks which are proven to reduce risks associated with common cyber threats. So think of all the analysis we had to do in the programmatic NIST CSF. We're not really having to do that here because, again, the organization, the cybersecurity organization that's published the framework has really already done that for us. So this is really where we want to gravitate to as, again, an SMB end customer as well as an SMB partner. Because as we've mentioned before several times, and I'm going to say it again, there are huge costs associated with doing the programmatic or risk-based assessment because we have to bring those resources in-house to perform those functions for us. But this raises another question. Okay, well, what you're saying here makes sense, especially from a cost perspective. But, how is it that CIS does this? How do they come up with their predefined and pre-prioritized set of recommended activities? And this is their methodology. Basically, what happens is the CIS organization, they come in and they, number one, they take as inputs assessments of what's going on in the security industry at that point in time. Some of the sources of input that they take are, number one, the Verizon breach investigation report. They basically absolutely go through that and take a look at it. Another source of input is the MSISAC. What's that? Well, that stands for Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And really what this is it's a CIS organization that is open to pretty much all government agencies, state, local, federal, tribal. Yeah, so if you're a government agency, you can join this organization, and basically it's another form of input that CIS takes in order to understand what's going on in the industry from a cybersecurity perspective. And then finally, they also take feedback from actual users, actual end customer organizations that are members of their community. And they take that information And then what they do is they parse it through the MITRE attack framework. And what does MITRE do? Well, MITRE is all about basically analyzing the security hacks of the day and basically understanding the techniques or sub-techniques that are used in that attack. Okay, great. So now we've basically got the attacks that are prevalent in today's world. We are able to break them down into categorized techniques or sub-techniques. And based on those techniques and sub-techniques, what CIS does is they basically provide recommendations with regard to what activities should be taken by organizations to protect them from these attacks. And this is where we get our CIS controls, benchmarks, implementation groups, safeguards. This is really how CIS comes to their recommended activities. They're predefined, pre-prescribed actions that organizations should take. So fundamentally, this is their methodology, and this is the underpinnings of why their framework, albeit a control framework, why their framework is really a very good framework and actually does provide measurable improvement for organizations that adopt it. So with the methodology defined, let's now dig into CIS itself. Because in the previous slide, I mentioned several things, safeguards, controls, all this other stuff. What does all that mean? Well, this slide, again, it introduces a bunch of stuff that is unique to CIS and their naming convention. So let's go ahead and unpack a bunch of these things. Let's start way over on the right in the lower right-hand corner, where we have 153 total safeguards. First off, what's a safeguard? Well, you can think of a safeguard as an actual action. This is the action. So CIS has identified 153 actions that organizations can take in order to improve their security posture. Great. Now, when we move over to or move up and or over, we now see the introduction of what's known as IGs, or implementation groups. What the implementation groups are groupings of these safeguards that basically, from CIS's perspective, really distinguish themselves based on the descriptions you see over on the left-hand side. So what is IG1, implementation group 1? Well, basically what this could be considered is your basic cyber hygiene level of actions. So basically, this is what CIS says, hey, we get it. You have, as an end customer, you have limited resources, it might be an S&B organization, and what you need to do is you need to get the most bang for your buck. IG1 is for you. This is basically the bare minimum activities you should implement in your security environment to protect against today's threats. Okay. Then we get to implementation group 2. What's that guy about? Well, that guy builds on top of implementation group 1 and basically provides enhanced activities that are, again, designed to address higher security needs for maybe different departments or different organizations that do require that level of protection. And then finally, again, implementation group 3, yep. That's the top of the line. That's where you're basically implementing stuff, pretty much all their policies. And again, what that's going to do is really provide protection against, as they say here, the most sophisticated attacks out there. So this is really how I want to say Microsoft, but how CIS really breaks down their pre-prescribed and predefined set of activities and how you should view them from again, a grouping perspective of where to begin in your security journey by implementing in implementation group 1 and building from there if necessary. Now, there's another thing that we need to worry about as well, because there's something called CIS controls. And What are CIS controls? They're basically what they're defined really as is essentially the groupings or how shall I say, um, these are groupings of activities that really fall under a particular type of activity. And this is really something that is used by CIS to say, hey, when we look at organizations all up, these are the different categories where the organization really needs to look at in order to, again, address their cybersecurity footprint. Now, how do we tie the implementation groups, the safeguards, as well as these controls together? Well, let's take a look at a specific example. What we're going to do here is we're going to look at the first control here, inventory and control of enterprise assets. And if we look at that as an example, this is basically how it's published by CIS. Number one, we have this control, inventory and control of enterprise assets. Underneath this control, we have these 5 safeguards. Establish and maintain a detailed enterprise asset inventory, address unauthorized assets, utilize an active discovery tool, use dynamic host configuration protocol logging to update enterprise asset inventory, use a passive asset discovery tool. These are all safeguards, actions that an organization can take to help shore up the security attack vector or threat vector that inventory and control of enterprise assets introduces as a category into an organization. So this is the relationship between the CIS controls and the safeguards. Where the implementation groups come in are over here on the right-hand side, and we can see 3 columns here for implementation group 1, implementation group 2, and implementation group 3. And you can see here where, based on what level of security posture an organization is shooting for, which of these safeguards they should deploy. So again, we're focusing right here on implementation group 1. So if that's what we're focusing on, then really what we should be looking to deploy is number 1, the 1.1, establish and maintain a detailed enterprise asset inventory, and number 2, basically address unauthorized assets. So you can see here, this is basically how we tie in the implementation groups into the CIS controls. Now, one last thing I want to point out here, because it's again, it's kind of going to be shown throughout this entire presentation, but we also have this column here for security function, identify, respond, detect, all these different things. Well, that may look familiar, and it should, because when we look at that stuff, that's really NIST CSF. So these are basically categories that NIST CSF has come up with in order to define what type, or, what the perspective is of the activity. So again, establish and maintain a detailed enterprise inventory list. That falls under the security function of identify. Yeah. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing a cross-play where these different frameworks actually have the ability to work together, and they're going to leverage resources from each other in order to provide, again, a holistic cybersecurity framework for end customers to look at.
Hey, David, just a quick check
Yep.
on time.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm talking too much. That's what I always do. I'm sorry. All right, so let's kick ahead. So at the end of the day, what can we say for organizations that leverage CIS and actually move to the CIS framework? Well, these are this is again based on CIS's internal analysis of end customers that have adopted their framework. For organizations that have adopted implementation group 1, this is the percentage improvement that they see in protection against attacks. And yeah, you might say, oh, well, 77% for malware, that's I'm not sure that's really that great. Also consider this, because what's not called out here in this chart is this simple fact. Yes, okay, we had 23% of customers that did have a malware attack, but what is not stated here is that for those 23% of customers that did, the blast radius, i.e. the impact of that infection, was minimized. So yes, even though an organization implemented in implementation group 1, they got hacked, the consequences of that attack and that breach were minimized such that, again, it was fairly quickly addressed. So these are really, again, the measures, then the improvements that CIS has found for organizations that have adopted their framework. All right, so that is CIS. That is really, again, the fundamental introduction to CIS. And again, the whole point here is to try and bring some clarity as to what we're talking about here, and to try and remove some of the cloud that may hang over, the CIS framework stuff, and why should I use it over others. Now, with that said, there is another framework that we really do need to address here, and that is Microsoft's Zero Trust framework and the deployment model. Are we saying at this point that for our partners and your end customers, you should ignore the Microsoft Zero Trust deployment plan? No, we most certainly are not. What we're doing here is we're saying, hey, Zero Trust is a Microsoft-specific, vendor-specific deployment plan. So yes, it absolutely has value, and yes, it's absolutely not something you want to ignore. And again, you shouldn't, because Microsoft is pushing this or advertising this. Your customers probably have heard about it, so it's not something that you want to simply eliminate. But what we're saying with CIS is that this is a vendor-neutral approach. So this is something that's just basically an architectural framework. And we keep coming back to that word, that can be used across vendor solutions. And in fact, if we take a look at Zero Trust and CIS, we can see that there are a boatload of correlations and crossovers between the Microsoft Zero Trust Foundation and the CIS framework, where you can see here, again, we have security policies and procedures at the top of the Zero Trust Foundation. And again, when we look at CIS, all of CIS is founded on that. We move over to identify users and roles. Well, that's directly relevant to CIS safeguard or control number 5, and so on and so on and so on. So don't think of these as one or the other. They are very complementary, with probably the most important aspect to take away from is that CIS is vendor neutral. This is, again, a vendor neutral framework that spans pretty much all vendors and all technologies. The Microsoft Zero Trust Foundation is a vendor-specific implementation of security that, again, is going to favor Microsoft-based solutions. Now, what that leads us into is this. To really try and bring this home for CIS, one of the big documents that are out there is, again, the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. And when we look at this thing and you see, we have 5,200 confirmed breaches. Well, if we do a further analysis and dig down deep into this, what we really can see as it relates to CIS is that for all of these breaches, basically there was some layer of the CIS controls that was not addressed in the organization. And more than that, when we dig even further into the Verizon data breach report, we can see here again a section dedicated to SMBs and identifying the top five attacks that SMBs are facing in today's world. And more than that, the justification as to why SMB customers need to worry about this. So make no mistake, CIS absolutely, as mentioned before, takes this into account, and that is the basis on which they are building their safeguards, their implementation groups, and their controls, and why, again, it is such a successful framework and why it is something that you really should be looking to adopt for your practice. So, with all that said, let's now switch gears and basically start looking at how it is that we as Ingram Micro can provide tools to you, the partner, to help you make this security a part of your MSP offering. And the first place we're going to start here is this. When we look at a traditional MSP, the security may not have always been a part of a traditional MSP's business model. But in today's world, as we've seen throughout all the industry press and all the attacks, this is not something that MSPs can afford to ignore anymore. And yes, we have our NIST categories up here of identify, protect, detect, and respond and recover. We really have to take into account coverage for all of these different NIST categories. And that's why, again, CIS and the tools and technologies that we want to introduce in the next few minutes really are important to you. But the problem with this stuff is, once again, it's going to be cost. And when we deal with SMB customers, we have to be very cost conscious because that is going to be one of their primary decision-making processes. How expensive is this and can I afford it? And what the problem with security is that a lot of times what we're faced with is we're faced with a choice between affordability, security, and usability. And it's with that in mind that we want to get into, again, how it is that you can build out your cybersecurity program. And what we're going to look at here, and what I'm going to do in a moment, is I'm going to hand the reins over to my colleagues, Brianna Lau, as well as David Bierman-Burr. And what they're going to do is they're going to, number one, provide you an introduction to, first off, how do you do an assessment on a customer to figure out where they are, what their security posture is, so you can implement and basically provide recommendations of activities and actions that they should perform in order to improve their security posture. Now, as a forewarning here, I will let you know that, I'm going to call this out, the fact that this webinar is actually the second webinar in a series. And what Brianna is really going to be going over right now is an abbreviated foreshadowing of what our next webinar is all about, which is all about cybersecurity assessments. So keep that in mind. And again, if you want more details, absolutely sign up for our next webinar happening on April 5th. But then for steps 2, 3, and 4, the other thing we want to introduce beyond the assessments is what David Bierman-Burr is going to get into, which is Microsoft 365 Business Premium, and how that suite, that solution, that cloud-based solution, has built into it so many security capabilities that are able to address all of these other aspects. And again, both of these things combined can help you, the partner, build out your security practice in a very, very cost-effective way. So with all of that said, Brianna, I am now shutting up and handing it over to you.
Thanks, David. If you want to progress to the next slide for me. All right, so when we think about adoption services, assessments are a great tool for you to get started in covering some of the gaps in your customer's current infrastructure, both on-prem or in the cloud. And by providing a tailored feedback on security risk through scan findings and recommendations on how to improve. There's truly value in level setting your customers using assessments, security assessments, to get your customers thinking a little bit deeper about security, their existing risks, maybe customers that have bought bits and bobs of applications from other providers or partners. That assessment that you can provide can really help them baseline what's been implemented correctly and if their existing investment is running well. So for partners looking to develop a security first MSP, this is an area that Ingram can support. We have our Center of Excellence is based in North America, Europe, and APAC that can help you set up 2 complementary scans and assessments that you can deliver for yourself or for your customers that are going to be directly aligned to the CIS Control V8 framework with reports and findings generated from a scan that we dissolve onto your customers' virtual machines or Azure. So how it works on the next slide, within 3 steps, our team can help you, 1, introduce the tool, 2, prepare your customers on a 30-minute call of the expected experience working alongside you, and then 3, execute the scan, which should be a half-day scan, and work with your customer, question your IT decision makers and business unit managers on their stance and gather the facts from there, plus be able to install a dissolvable agent onto your customer's Azure environment or on-premises Windows virtual machine to gather the insight and reports that will then be tailored towards a presentation deck as well as a report that aligns to the CIS V8 framework. So like David had said on the next slide, we'll usually spend some time to go through just what the scan entails from start to finish, but we will have a webinar on April 5th where we're going to bring in our Center of Excellence team specifically and have them explain kind of the process from start to finish and how you can use these assessments as a real way to quantify value to your customers and start opening that conversation around security. So with that, I'll pass it to David, who'll be talking about 2 and 4 of how we can get started.
Thanks, Brianna. So we did put up a couple of assets that are in say a preview state today, because as we saw on the first slide, there's 4 main components of getting a program off the ground. One is, you do need a mechanism to assess your customer's environment. For most MSPs, they don't want to, especially if they're operating at IG1, they usually don't want to take a customer on until they're in that state, and it's usually a project to get them into that state. So now you can support them, with a managed service that's aligned to that. And so you need to do an assessment to see where they're at today, and then show them where you're going to take them by turning on the security controls, cleaning a lot of things up. In a lot of cases, you probably have outdated software, other things that you want to clean up before you kind of sort of adopt them into your professionally run managed service. But there's other things that are needed. Most customers need a IT security policy. If they don't have one, it's really hard to back up all the things that you're going to be doing for them or that they need to be doing. So we put together a sample template. This is pulled from the SANS organization, so it's a very credible starting point. And this is something that I recommend customizing a bit for each customer, because it just gives you a place to write down, what are you going to do? Are we going to enroll the devices in Intune or not? If you are, write it down, right? And just sort of set the standard so that everyone knows what the standard is, and then if you need to change it, you can just change the document and move on. But it also helps keep things from going off the rails. So next slide. The other piece we have for you is a reference architecture. This is a single document that has every recommended setting for Microsoft 365 Business Premium, so that if you don't know how things should be set, you can simply grab this guide. It's the same guidance as you'll see across the Microsoft documentation set, but we pulled it all into one place, so you don't have to hunt around for stuff. And then also where appropriate, where we thought there was a specific policy needed for SMBs, for example, I'll pick on the BitLocker policy. There's a lot of things you could do with BitLocker, but we just showed you the way we think is the right way to do BitLocker for SMBs, where you just turn it on, make sure the keys are backed up in Azure and have no end user interaction. So that's what you can find in that guide, and it comes in 2 forms: a verbose version with a description of all the settings, and then a lightweight version that just has the checklist so you can quickly run through it with a customer or in your planning. Let's have a look at the next slide. We also have another a bit of reference architecture that's much more detailed, aligned to the Microsoft Zero Trust Framework. Next slide. And the last bit is you're often going to need to integrate your program into other processes and tooling, right? Just because I would say Microsoft 365 Business Premium is capable of addressing, maybe 80% of a customer's need with regard to the framework, but there's going to be other stuff. There's going to be tooling in place that the partners have, like your RMM and PSA. We want to pull into this. There's going to be infrastructure bits outside of Microsoft 365, like the network, switches, routers, and firewalls that also need to be incorporated. And so part of the work is figuring out the processes just for keeping up with the framework. For example, I often, recommend a monthly review of different items, just to make sure everything's on track, make sure device cleanup rules are in place, things like that. Let's have a look at the next slide. So this is a little bit of I like to bring up this point, is that complexity is usually the enemy of security. It's often the enemy of productivity as well. I think it's super important to not build complex systems. I think it's important to eliminate what we call snowflakes. So, and what I mean by that is if you're implementing a framework like this, it's often important to have, sort of a standard minimum baseline that you don't go below. So, for example, you don't want to have a bespoke offering for every single customer, or necessarily, allow customers to steer you off your path. It's oftentimes best to steer them into a standard path that you can support. That's the minimum, right? Consider IG1, and you can always do more, but it's problematic when you do less. And examples of this would be not fully implementing a control, or if, getting an inventory of the assets and sticking to that inventory feels difficult for the customer. It's usually worth investing the time to get it right, so that you not only you help them meet the baseline, but we're not custom crafting something or offering anything less than what we consider the minimum baseline for security, because that oftentimes, threat actors are really good at probing through all the different areas and finding a soft spot at a customer. That's why we have this framework to help cover, all areas of cybersecurity, even the things we may not be thinking of. Also think it's important to maintain what we call minimum effective dose, right? Make sure we can contain the scope of what we're trying to do. A lot of this control framework isn't that complicated. So I think that's really important. And then I do discourage exceptions, right? Oftentimes people are used to working a certain way and may want to continue working a certain way or doing things a certain way. And I'd really just challenge those. Of course, sometimes exceptions are needed to be made, but I like to challenge them and try to see, is this really something necessary? Or is it just people have been doing something a certain way, and just can't imagine doing it a different way? An example of that might be, there might be a reluctance to put in a control to block unauthorized assets. I can just go into the data breach report and show devastating attacks that were the result of an unauthorized asset permitted to connect to the network that the customer had no idea was possible, because they didn't think about it, right? And so I like to discourage those as exceptions, and also show people that the thing that they may be objecting to can actually, we can find a solution for it that does fit within the framework and within their model of operating their business. Okay, next slide, please. So a couple of the things that I really recommend the partners to do is really understand help the customers understand the why of cybersecurity. What I find when addressing these frameworks, if the customer doesn't see this as good for their business or a business requirement, it's very hard to justify everything that comes after. So the starting point here is let them understand why we're doing this, right? We're going to invest some amount of effort, time and money, to get security right so that they don't suffer a calamity. It's much, much cheaper to implement a framework before something bad has happened than during or after. And a good example of this was a former customer of mine at a power company, about 400 employees. They rejected a proposal from a security vendor. I think would have cost them somewhere around 30 to 50 grand to implement the control framework. And they didn't absolutely reject it. They just said they wanted to do it themselves. And so it went away. They didn't do anything, honestly. They just sat on it. And a couple years later, they had a pretty devastating ransomware attack. They got everything. All the employees had to be sent home. Took about two and a half weeks to rebuild infrastructure just to let the employees come back. And by no means was the infrastructure back up. They just had stuff working. And I don't know what they spent for that, but I estimate it was somewhere between $500,000 to $5 million to recover. So, that's an example of just how the extreme end of how much more it can cost to recover. And it would have been so much simpler to just spend the 50 grand, get things under control before that happened. I think it's important to use zero trust language and simplified concepts. A lot of times we're cybersecurity pros, when we're talking about these things and we're talking about the technical details, things get lost on the customer. So I like to use simple analogies. Like you probably heard from Microsoft, we have our home security analogy, what we're kind of trying to protect all areas of the home, not just locking the front door. Things like that I think are very relatable. I do recommend presenting a shared responsibility model. This is crucial. We have an example of this for you, but it just informs the customer what they're responsible for, right? You may be responsible for securing or responding to problems, but they're responsible for telling you a problem exists. Is one example of the shared responsibility model, right? It's not the customers. You don't want to set the expectation that they don't have to do anything and all security will be handled. It's a little bit of a shared model, and it gives you the opportunity to kind of adjust if you do need to have a lower cost offering for certain customers. Maybe you do that with a shared responsibility model where you're pushing more responsibility to them, but nothing's being dropped in the framework. So we're still maintaining the same baseline. They're going to sign up for more work if you need to get price down somehow, and use templates as a starting point. Next slide, please. So it gave you a number of resources for download, the CSAT assessment, our cyber assessment workbook. It's a simple workbook that Alex Fields came up with. It's great for just going through the framework. Policy templates, the security guide that we wrote at Microsoft, which can serve as your starting point for all the settings in Microsoft 365 Business Premium, our shared responsibility reference sheet, and baseline security configurations. And again, these are starting points just to help you get started, so you don't have to come up with this all on your own. All right, Bree, do we have time for objections, or should we close it off?
I think we should close it off. Dave, if you want to just skip through the objection handling, move to the next steps in closing. So I'd love to thank everyone for your time here. Like I said, this is one of the many series that we have around helping our partners build a seamless security partner practice. I wanted to bring to your attention that registration for Ingram Micro Global Cloud and Innovation Summit is now open. If you've been to our previous events, originally called Cloud Summit, this is our newly expanded event happening in Las Vegas, Nevada. So that's going to be very exciting. We are open for registration. So if you're looking to network, build partnerships, access to workshops, new age technology, and discover some of the latest and greatest, we will be accepting registrations for the event that's happening on May 15th to 17th this year. So save your spot today and hope to see you there. Thank you so much, everyone.